It might feel like we're getting off topic from React, but don't sweat it. We're almost done, and tooling really is an integral part of learning React. As you've seen, when a project gets larger, it's nearly impossible to write all of our JSX into a single HTML file and rely upon the transformer to compile it for us. So just hang on a little bit longer, and we're going to get a solid build process together. As we saw in the last section, we had a working build process that converted all of our JSX into JavaScript and joined it into a single file. But that led to errors when we tried to run it in our browser because the concatenation step would just join all of our files together randomly, or excuse me, by alphabetical order. And it ran, and we got errors where the first file would make reference to another component that hadn't even been defined yet. So to fix this problem, we're going to introduce one more tool, and that tool is going to be called Browserify. Browserify is a tool that allows us to write modules of code. In React, we put one component into each module, and each component lives in a separate file. So really, you can start thinking about each of these files as a single class, a single React class, and a single module. These modules are each, by definition, going to be in separate files. When I want to use one module in another module, I can use the require syntax that we saw inside the gulp file to load this file into another one. So the key thing to keep in mind when we're using Browserify is that each module of code that we write, so each file, doesn't really know that the other files even exist until we make a specific reference to it, until we ask Browserify to include that other file into this one. So if I were to write in here, if I were to write just thumbnail, because of course my thumbnail list requires thumbnail, this would throw an error right here because this file will not know that thumbnail exists at all. If I want to import, if I want to use thumbnail inside of my thumbnail list, I have to specifically ask Browserify to import thumbnail in here. And I do that by saying var thumbnail. And this thumbnail right here can really be any name, but by convention, we call it whatever the component that is that we're requiring in. And I'm going to write require thumbnail. So this line reads, go and find some module in my project with a file name of thumbnail and assign it to the variable thumbnail. In React terminology, it means go find the component thumbnail and store it in the variable thumbnail because I want to use this in the component that I'm currently building. The variable thumbnail is now the class thumbnail, so we can render it, we can pass properties to it, etc. So why is this handy? Why do we want to pull our code apart in this manner? We do this because it allows us to solve issues with concatenating all of our files. Browserify is very smart about loading code in the correct order, so long as we set up our require statements correctly. So if we have a component A that depends on component B will always load component A first so that we don't get an error when it's time to render it. So in more practical vocabulary, thumbnail list depends on thumbnail. So long as we require thumbnail before we use it in this file, we're never going to get an error here because Browserify is going to make sure that thumbnail is going to be an instance of thumbnail. Excuse me, thumbnail is going to be a reference to thumbnail, not an instance. This solves the issue we had earlier where we were trying to render our thumbnail list here inside of our concatenated file. We were trying to render thumbnail list before we even defined what thumbnail list was. Browserify is especially useful with React components because we can build a component that has a very clearly defined API or interface. And then we can require that component into another file. And so long as that interface is very clean and very distinct, it's going to be very easy to use that imported file inside another one. So, I mean, what does that mean in practical terms? Well, let's consider badge for a second. Badge has only two properties required, a title and a number, right? Well, since this is a very straightforward interface, all I have to do is provide it two properties. It makes it easy to use inside of other components as a completely reusable badge. So let's imagine for a second that we have another component in here, and it's called form. And I want to use badge inside of this new component. So I'm going to write var badge require badge. So now I'm telling Browserify, hey, when you go to load this code right here, I need to have access to badge before any of the other code in here will work properly. So for our form component, and again, this is just for an example, we're not going to be making a form component just yet. Let's imagine that somewhere in here we have our render function sometime later. And this render function is going to return just div, and I want to make use of badge. And to make badge work correctly, as we know, all we have to do is provide it text and number. And now badge is going to work perfectly fine out of the box. And so I get this incredibly reusable code. I can use badge absolutely anywhere I want by just saying var badge require badge and then using it inside of this component. And I know that it's going to work out of the box just fine so long as I make use of its very small API here, which is just to require or provide text and number. So this gets very important and very useful in the open source community because there are repositories out there where there are tremendous numbers of pre-coded components written by other people that I can install on my machine as an NPM module and then require into this file right here and instantly render it on my page. So for example, if I want to say make an autocompleter, I could go download an autocompleter module, place it into my project directory right here, and then just say autocompleter, require autocompleter, and then I'm just going to run autocompleter, and let's say it just takes a list of things like so. And now, with very little effort on my part, I have access to this autocompleter because I'm following this pattern here, the pattern of using Browserify and writing all of my code in a module-based format. So I hope that this illustrates some of the usefulness of using Browserify here and following the convention of writing my code in modules and using Browserify to determine or to specify dependencies between my different files. So now that we have an idea, and before we go any further, I'm going to delete this form file because it was just for examples. So now that we have a little bit of a better idea here of how Browserify works and what it's going to do for us by specifying dependencies between different files by using the require keyword, we're going to use it in our project. And here's the game plan for doing so. First, we're going to update our gulp file to make use of Browserify. And then we're going to refactor each of our components to make sure that they use require to require in the different components they need. So for example, thumbnail list needs thumbnail to be required in. And I'm going to delete this for now. We're going to do this in the next section. And for example, my actual thumbnail needs badge to be required in before thumbnail will work properly. So let's get started with updating the gulp file in the next section.